It's our privilege today to be speaking with Trent Sheppard. Trent Sheppard is the author of God on Campus, Sacred Causes and Global Effects, available from IVP. Trent, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a joy to be with you.
Trent, we understand from the author's note at the close of the book that you knew J Edwin Orr, the Irishman who became the great historian of revivalism, that you knew him personally. How is it that you came to know J Edwin Orr?
Well, Jonathan, the short version is that Dr. Orr mentored my parents. And so he was, I guess you could describe him like a spiritual godfather to me. Some of my earliest memories when I was a little kid, because of my father's work, he was a pastor for many years and then was involved in denominational leadership, and they would host these revival conferences at a place out in North Carolina, and then a place out in, I think it was in New Mexico as well. And Dr. Orr would come out and teach a load of pastors and others about spiritual awakening and revival movements. And I have really happy memories from that time. You got to remember, Dr. Orr was a man with, I think he had 4 earned doctorate degrees. And so he was, I mean, this was a remarkable thinker and brilliant historian. But what always stood out to me was he always had time for a little kid. At the time, I was like 7, 8 years old. And he always had time for us. I have very happy memories of him walking up to me with his rich Irish accent, always saying, "Hi, chum, how's your thumb?" And so, yeah, really special times. He would spend a lot of time at our house as well, where I grew up in Georgia. And we also spent some time with him at these revival seminars in the summer at Oxford University, again, when I was a little boy, and having no idea the measure of the man that I was speaking with. But I look back on that now with so much gratitude. I wish he was still around so I could ask him some questions now, honestly.
Trent, we understand from the book that you have known Pete Greig for some time. The book was published in 2009, and at that time, you two were collaborating on a Campus America prayer movement. In what directions has this prayer movement gone, say, in the last 10 years?
Well, first, let me say about Pete. Pete is a dear friend, and I would say that he is probably one of the most significant and important voices and leaders in the prayer movement worldwide right now. And if you're not familiar with the 24/7 prayer movement that emerged out of the UK in 1999, it is well worth checking out and how it has spread since then. And in 2009, 2010 specifically, actually even a few years before that, Pete and I were collaborating on a very audacious dream, I guess you could call it, to see a prayer and missions movement established and coming out of every campus in the United States. Obviously, there were a load of other people involved, but one of the reasons I got so deeply involved was because Pete asked me to take a part of it. And I think that Campus America was part of a wider movement in prayer that was going before and is continuing to go on now. And I think that some of the exciting directions that I see it going in at present is that if on the one hand you could imagine there's like this prayer movement in different parts of the body of Christ, and on the other hand you've got this missions movement in the different parts of the body of Christ. I think one of the most exciting things is that right now, in a unique way, those movements are coming together. Now, historically, those things, they often go together. I think theologically, you want them to go together, but sometimes you can have people in different camps. And what is so exhilarating, and Pete has played a big part in this as well, is seeing those movements begin to learn from one another and encourage one another. And I think as a result, it means that things are spreading both in prayer and in mission. So that has been very exciting to watch in the last few years.
Trent, what would have surprised you most to learn then what you now know about the direction of the prayer movement?
I think that probably most surprising and I'd say probably most encouraging is that there is a new willingness within the body to learn from one another, and for different streams of the body to learn from those with expertise in different areas. So let me give an example as I relate to like that unity and that oneness in the body. So 24/7 prayer specifically, again, out of the United Kingdom that has since gone global, they have these annual gatherings. A few years ago, I think it was in 2015, and then I think they did it again this year. They hosted their annual global gathering in Vienna, Austria. Now, the reason they did that was because the Bishop of Vienna, the Cardinal, the Catholic Bishop, Cardinal Schönborn is his name. So he had invited Pete and the 24/7 guys to come and to have a big celebration there with thousands of others in St. Stephen's Cathedral. And I think watching this 24/7 movement that is, these are really dynamic folks. A lot of them are just tattooed up and, they're on the edge in so many wonderful ways. And watching them pile into this old, beautiful Catholic cathedral and to be welcomed by the Cardinal and to say that we want to learn together how we can be a part of prayer and mission in our time. No, I didn't see that coming. And that is, it should encourage us all because the body's learning from each other.
We're privileged today to be speaking with Trent Sheppard, author of God on Campus, Sacred Causes and Global Effects. Trent, some of the greatest movements in all of church history can trace their beginnings to university campuses. And I suppose we could include in that list Martin Luther's Reformation and in Wittenberg, and also the early Methodism of John Wesley and George Whitefield at Oxford University. What is it exactly about campuses that make them such fertile soil for prayer movements?
Yeah, I think it's such an important thing to think about. And I'm not sure actually who coined this phrase, but there's been some really interesting research that has been done on what has been called revival communities. And the idea behind it is that oftentimes when you're watching where a revival or in time what can even be a spiritual awakening takes place, is that you see that there is a lot of crossover in people's lives. So what I mean by that is that they're living in the same area, they may be eating in the same area. There's crossover in their lives on a regular basis. So in our modern age, for example, what's happened is that you live in one place. You may commute 45 minutes or an hour to where you work. And then you go out to somewhere else, maybe to have lunch. Then you may be going somewhere else for church. And those worlds, those different worlds that you're a part of, they rarely are intertwined with one another. So what's interesting about a campus is that all of those worlds are uniquely together. And so one historian described college campuses for that reason as one of the last natural revival communities that we have. Very simply because you have students who are living together, they're sharing dormitories together, they're studying together, they're eating together. And what it means is it creates an environment for real honesty, a lack of pretense. As you know, confession and honesty is so essential in these moments of spiritual transformation. And that honesty, that openness about all aspects of your life, I think can take place in a campus setting. Added to that, of course, you have young people and who are wrestling deeply with the questions of life and who are also willing to take risk. There is that wonderful zeal inside in a young person that enables them to believe great things for God, to expect great things for God. And maybe that's why Jesus talked to us about being more like kids to come into his kingdom. So I think those two things combined, those revival community environments, youthfulness of campuses, create a really, really fertile soil for revival movements to grow.
Trent, I'm intrigued by your idea of this crossover space as an area where revival is bred, if you will. In that light, what is your prognosis for the usefulness of online prayer? Is the online environment a medium that would be natural for prayer? What's your view?
Well, that is a great question. I think I'll say it like this, is that it's a wonderful tool. And for example, it means that you and I right now, I mean, I'm in Boston, you're in Chicago, right?
Correct.
And so, I mean, that we get to have this kind of interaction, that's incredible. That's a gift, and it's something that needs to be treasured. And so I think you can obviously have deeply meaningful times in online prayer, just like what we're experiencing in the interview right now. Simultaneously, though, in my own opinion, there is no substitute for sitting in a living room or whatever it is, a classroom with people face to face. And again, I think it creates an authenticity, a depth, a lack of pretense that can come across sometimes in an online setting that you can't hide so easily when you're face to face in the living room or a classroom. And so I think it's both a gift, but it's also something that can never substitute what takes place in real life face to face.
Thank you so much for that perspective. I think we resonate with you. Yeah, thanks for touching on those themes. Trent, the haystack revival of 1806 started with 5 students on the campus of Williams College when they gathered to pray. A thunderstorm that day drove them to seek the shelter of a haystack for the remainder of their prayer service. What were some of the global effects of this unassuming prayer meeting?
Wow, the 1806 haystack prayer meeting is one of my favorite moments. And let me just, before even going to the global effects, I just want to provide a little context that I think is so important and that we sometimes overlook. And I'm pretty sure I mentioned it in God on Campus, although it was a few years ago when I wrote it, so I may be thinking of something else. But the main young man who is involved in a sort of creating the environment for that to take place. So there's 5 of them. They're praying there together. And Samuel Mills was the key factor in those 5 in the sense that he was a freshman, but he had been thinking about things related to missions and a bit more global thinking, more and longer than the other ones had, even though he was a freshman. And one of the things that he said at that prayer meeting, they're praying about some different places around the world, specifically about China on that day. It was the summer of 1806, and they're praying about China. And it was the thunderstorm, the electricity in the air that created this sense of real expectation with them. But at some point, Samuel Mills looked up and he said, "We can do this if we will." So not we will do this if we can, which is how we typically roll. But he says, we can do this if we will. Now, I had heard that story probably since all the way back from when I knew Dr. Orr when I was a little kid. And I had always imagined Samuel Mills to be just this legendary figure, maybe like such a compelling personality, deep voice, I don't know. And that's how I imagined him saying that. But his roommate is describing him in a letter. It was in 1810. And how he describes Samuel Mills is he says he was an awkward fellow with a croaking sort of voice. And that was so powerful for me, and I think so powerful for students to think about. So this was not a guy who, with such gusto, goes, "We can do this if we will." I mean, he is an awkward, down-to-earth, ordinary guy. So it's more like, "We can do this if we will." He's normal. And I think that's so important when we think about the global impact that then comes out of the haystack prayer meeting. Because again, you can sometimes make these moments more magical than they were. These were down-to-earth students praying, but they're praying to this extraordinary God who takes their very ordinary gift of their lives and then transforms it, and it goes somewhere. And so some of the global effects, a couple of weeks ago, I had the wonderful privilege to teach in Kona, Hawaii, out at Youth with a Missions University campus out there. It was such a wonderful time. I've got old roots with Youth with a Mission, and I love being with them. And one of the things I got to do while I was there was see this plaque down by the water where the first Protestant missionaries had come to the big island of Hawaii in I think it was 1818 or 1820. And they came right out of that movement that began from the haystack prayer meeting. They came out of that same wave of missions that begins to develop specifically in response to those 5 students going, wow, we can do this. We can give our lives overseas. Another real personal thing that I know about from that time is we had a dear friend of mine from Turkey here just a couple of months ago. He was speaking at a famous church here in Boston called Park Street. And the reason Turkey's close to our heart is that's where my wife actually grew up. And one of the things we discovered while my friend was here were that the first Protestant missionaries to ever go to Turkey actually landed in the ancient biblical city of Smyrna, which is now known as Izmir, which is the city my wife grew up in. They came in the year 1819 from Park Street Church in Boston, sent out from that same first wave of Protestant missionaries that are a direct result of the haystack prayer meeting just a few years before in 1806. So both, religious and non-religious historians alike will trace the emergence of the American foreign missions movement right back to those 5 praying students in the summer of 1806 at Williams College. And it still goes on today. And that's amazing when you think about it.
That is amazing. Thank you so much, Trent, for sharing those personal reflections as well. Trent, the businessman's revival of 1857 may be the most remarkable story ever concerning the explosive growth of a church prayer meeting. In the autumn of 1857, Jeremiah Lanphier conducted a series of noon prayer meetings, which were meant to bring together businessmen from Lower Manhattan. This was to the church of the North Dutch Reformed Church. The first day of his prayer meetings, only 5 shuffled in. The next week, we had apparently about 20, and the next week after that, we had about 40. But then in October of 1857, we have the first global financial crisis, and soon thousands were praying, not only in the North Dutch Reformed Church, but through churches through the city, and there were about 10,000 praying per day. What is it that we can take from this story of an extraordinary, explosive prayer meeting?
Yeah. Wow. Well, there's so much there, isn't there? I think one thing is that, point one, people pray in a time of crisis, to put it plainly. I mean, things were already shaky in New York when Lanphier began leading people to pray. And I think my prayer would be that our churches, our Christian communities are always a safe place where people feel like they can go in times of crisis. And because people pray in those moments, and we want our doors to be wide open for those moments of crisis and prayer. I think another lesson learned is that the steadiness of those prayer meetings every day at noon during the lunch hour, that was the idea. You didn't have to take off time from work. You could just come during your lunch hour. I think the steadiness of it provided something that was desperately needed in that time. I think of that, the dire need for something like that in our day. Just a steady time when people are face to face in prayer. I think we also have to keep in mind that it was biblically speaking, you would call this a kairos moment. There was a fullness of time, and that had to do socially, politically, religiously, all of that. There were all sorts of forces at work that were contributing to a desperation in people's heart for change. The last thing I'll mention on this is that Dr. Orr, we talked about earlier in the interview, Dr. Orr did his work at Oxford University when he did his DPhil there. He did it on this prayer movement specifically, what transpired before and afterwards. And one of the things that Dr. Orr pointed out, and it was overwhelming actually, I think, for me to see, is that even in the midst of this civil war, which comes just shortly after this time, and literally the country is just being torn to pieces, as it grapples with so much change and confronting such an entrenched evil in slavery, one of the things that Dr. Orr talked about was how that on both sides of the conflict, people were praying. And on both sides of the conflict, there was confession and transformation that was beginning to take place. And I just want you to think about that for a second. Think about how in God's timing and God's framework, how God also was working towards change. Now, obviously, war can only do so much. It can never change something inside of someone's heart. And I think this many years on from the Civil War, we're still right now dealing with entrenched issues of racism in our time. And I think, again, we have to go back and to go, something has to be done in the place of prayer that was beginning to happen during this land fear movement, that I think, God willing, will continue to spread and heal this deep, deep wound in our land. So yeah, that was a long answer to a short question, but there's so much at work in that movement.
We're so grateful for your reflections. Trent, in the wake of the summer conferences conducted in partnership with D.L. Moody at the Northfield Mount Hermon School, there were 100 students who committed their lives to world evangelization. And within a generation, we understand that about 100,000 students had followed suit. What would a new student volunteer movement look like today?
Yeah, it's actually, and I only discovered this myself recently, it's actually more like about 175,000 students who in time, within a generation, signed this pledge that was coming out from this movement known as the Student Volunteer Movement. And a couple of quick thoughts on it. Again, just some historical perspective. So many folks don't know that movement actually began before 1886. 1886 was the Mount Hermon 100, which it's sort of like a tipping point in the movement. But a number of years before that, at Mount Holyoke College, so a young woman by the name of Grace Wilder, she was a student there between 1880 and 1883, I think it was. And 34, this was an all-women's seminary at the time, 34 young women sign a pledge, basically that we are willing and desirous to give our lives to wherever God would call us, even if it be in a foreign land. Now that pledge is what then Grace Wilder's brother, Robert Wilder, takes to the Mount Hermon Conference in 1886. Then 100 students, young men, sign that same pledge, a little different wording, and then the movement begins. And again, like you said, within a generation, 175,000 students signed this pledge. 20,000 of those students actually then give their lives in overseas mission service. There has never been anything like it since in terms of that convergence of prayer and mission and student awakening. In terms of what it could look like today, oh, Lord, let it be. Let me say first, Lord, let it be. I think that there's all sorts of lessons to be learned from that movement, the student volunteer movement. I think they had a unique connection, and I'll describe it like this. And we use this phraseology back in the Campus America prayer time. They had this unique connection of mission, mercy, and marketplace. Mission, mercy, and marketplace. And I think because of that, they had a deep and a practical theology of vocation that was intertwined in their understanding of mission. And so they went out with this fiery watchword. They called it it was the evangelization of the world in this generation. So these were fiery evangelists. Simultaneously, though, they are establishing schools, colleges, and hospitals along the way. These are some of the most well-educated people and from the finest institutions in the world at that time who have signed this pledge. So I think there was this deep and practical theology of vocation that was mixed in. And so they saw it all as one, your mission, your mercy, and your marketplace. And my prayer is that right now students will begin to get that fire within them so that they know that the calling of a preacher is no more holy than, say, a calling of a school teacher. And somehow if that gets intertwined in us and that same passion for mission that drives the missionary to their knees in a remote tribe, drives someone else to their knees in a laboratory. And there's a convergence of those things that happen. And they have a deep and practical theology of vocation that affects every sphere of society and all of life. That is what we desperately need in our time. And if that were to happen, then yes, we would see a new movement of mission, mercy, and marketplace today, hopefully from our campuses. Yeah.
Trent, this book is not just for you, what we say, an intellectual exercise, but this is also a lived reality. You've been working with campus movements for a number of years now. What advice would you have to someone beginning or participating in a new campus movement of prayer?
That's a great question. I'd say one, we learn to pray by praying. I think my buddy Pete Gregg taught me that. We learn to pray by praying. You don't start a prayer movement by, getting everybody on board. You start praying in that way by beginning to pray you on your own and with your friends. Don't complicate it. We learn to pray by praying. I'd say number two, learn from those who have gone before us. It's one of the reasons I wrote God on Campus. Pete Gregg asked me to write it. And one of the reasons he asked is we want to be able to learn from those who have gone before us on campus. Learn from the awakenings in the past, learn the things they did so incredibly well, and learn the things that maybe they should have done differently. And then when you are in the middle of your prayer, in the middle of the risk-taking that usually comes after prayer, put those things into practice. And third, I'd say, take a prayer risk. Do something like what 24/7 prayer encourages you to do. And you can go online, and I think it's just 24-7prayer.com. They can teach you how to just create a little prayer room for 3 days on your campus. Take a dorm room or an empty classroom or something, if you can get permission, and transform it into a place of prayer for a few days. And you will be so surprised by what happens when you make a list, begin to spread the word, and invite others into that room to pray in creative ways. How that those slots quickly get filled, and before you know it, something beautiful can be born right there in the heart of a campus. Yeah.
Trent, thank you so much for your time today. If I can close with a question that we've been asking all of the participants in this interview program, and that is this: what would it mean for the church to be united today? How would we recognize this unity, and what is it that we can do as Christians to pursue the unity for which Jesus prayed in John 17?
Yes. The great unanswered prayer of Jesus, okay, in John 17, that his body, his church, his people would be one. In terms of what it would look like, I think quite practically, I think it would mean that not everyone in our churches on Sunday morning would look like us. Quite practically. I think that would be one of the signs. I think that it's hard to articulate what exactly that unity, how it would unfold specifically, but I think that we will certainly know it when we see it. And one of the reasons we'll know it is because we will sense the presence of God right in the middle of it. God promises that there's a certain blessing that comes in that unity. And it was part of what in even the book of Acts and those days of waiting, and as they're praying together, there's some form of unity that's growing in their hearts, into which then the Holy Spirit comes in such a unique and powerful way. The rest is history. So I think we will know it when we see it. I think practically, in terms of what we might do to work and move in that direction, I think one, we need to lift high King Jesus. We need to lift high King Jesus, even more than unity. We lift high King Jesus, and then somehow he gathers people to himself. I think two, we got to recognize that none of us have the whole truth. Again, that is such an exciting mark. I would say an encouraging mark of our age is that there is a new willingness within the body to learn from one another. And that's a good thing, because none of us have the whole truth. And then I think the final thing is this: we got to be quick to confess when the Holy Spirit convicts us of not loving or honoring our brother and sister. We're going to be quick to confess when the Holy Spirit convicts us of not honoring or loving our brother or sister. I think those are some of the elements that can create the sort of unity that we're all longing for in the body. Lord, let it be, eh? Lord, let it be.
Amen. It's been our delight today to be speaking with Trent Sheppard, author of God on Campus, Sacred Causes and Global Effects. Trent, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much. It's been a joy to be with you.